So let's go over Putin's grand strategy for destroying the US dollar. I will also point out that of all the world leaders in the world, I would say only Vladimir Putin seems to be strategic, okay? The guy actually is able to think long term and execute with perfect timing. He's a chess player, okay? And he's really the only world leader that's able to think so far ahead and plan so strategically. So let's go over his strategy. Basically, his strategy is very simple. There are lots of different nations that have been sanctioned by the Americans. How can I form a relationship with these nation states in order to create volatility in the world to destabilize global trade and therefore destabilize the US dollar? Okay? Also, there are some nation states that participate in the system but who are not happy about the system. So how can I actually break them away from dependence on America? All right? So these are nations that have been sanctioned by the Americans, including Russia, Iran, okay, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Belarus, Myanmar. Okay, so Myanmar is a civil war. Forget about them. Venezuela has been conquered by the Americans. Syria is destroyed. Okay, so basically there are 4 countries left: Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea. So these 4 are going to work together in order to destabilize the global order, in order to destroy the American empire. Okay, all right. So the key is Iran and North Korea. Okay, we've already talked a lot about Iran, so today I want to talk more about North Korea. So right now, Russia and North Korea have become very, very close. So last year, this is actually 2 years ago, June 2024, Putin visited North Korea and signed a mutual defense pact with North Korea. This is a very, very big deal, because what a mutual defense pact means is that in the case that North Korea is attacked, Russia must militarily come to the defense of North Korea. If Russia is attacked, North Korea must come to the defense of Russia. Okay? This is a big deal because previously, North Korea had a mutual defense pact with China, signed in 1961. After the Korean War. And so you would think that North Korea doesn't really need Russia because North Korea already has China to protect it. So why is Vladimir Putin signing a mutual defense pact with Kim Jong-un? This is very strange. Okay? Well, I think if we wait a couple of years, we'll know the answer. All right. Another thing to keep in mind is that Kim Jong-un has been very supportive of Russia's war in Ukraine. In fact, he sent 10,000 troops to Ukraine. And the thing about the North Koreans is that at first, they're not very well trained. They're not very disciplined. But the thing about the North Koreans is they fight to the end, okay? They have a policy of not surrendering to the enemy. If you do surrender to the enemy, guess what happens to your family back in North Korea? Okay? So the thing about the North Koreans, remember, is that yes, they're poor, they're not technologically sophisticated, but their soldiers are willing to fight to the bitter end. And that's actually the key to winning a war. All right. So everyone makes fun of North Korea, okay? Because it's a very poor place. So if you compare North Korea to South Korea, the GDP per person is only $771, okay? That's it. That's it. Whereas in South Korea, it's over 33,000. It's one of the highest in the world. Look at this map, okay, of a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula at night. This is South Korea, okay? This is North Korea. Pretty big difference, guys. Huge difference, right? But in a war, this place would defeat this place. Okay? Why? Because in this class, what you're taught is game theory. And if you look at how wars are fought and who wins wars? Societies that win wars have three characteristics, okay? They have energy, they're open, and they have cohesion. Now, what's important for us to understand is that the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be energetic, open, and cohesive. Okay? And you're like, that's retarded. South Korea is wealthy, it has technology, it has a lot of weaponry, it has American support. The problem with Western capitalistic societies is that they tend to be very individualistic, as well as complacent and unequal. Okay? You can tell because of the birth rate, right? Where in North Korea, the fertility rate is still 1.81. It's not great, but look at South Korea, 0.81. Okay? So in 50 years' time, South Korea will lose 80% of its people. North Korea will also lose people, but just if there's no war, if we just keep on going, eventually South Korea will go to zero and North Korea will still be around, okay? But the other difference is that when you're poor, you're not afraid to die, right? You have nothing to lose. Whereas if you're rich, well, you want to live, okay? So all North Korea has to do is basically say, you know what, we have artillery. And this is Seoul, okay? You can see how close Seoul is to the border. So all North Korea has to do is tell the Koreans, you either pay us a lot of money or we'll go attack you. Right? It's that simple. And the South Koreans will be like, we'll give you money, just please don't attack us. And what this is going to do is create a lot of tension in Southeast Asia. It's going to have to bring in Japan as well as the United States. Okay? So now, Putin's defense pact with North Korea makes a lot of sense. Because if North Korea just creates a problem in the Korean Peninsula, this is going to be a huge problem for Japan and the United States. And remember, the United States is already distracted in Iran. It doesn't have the forces in order to defend South Korea. Okay? This is going to create a lot of instability. All right, let's move on. Germany, guys. Okay, so after Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe and the United States responded by imposing sanctions on Russia. The problem is that Germany was dependent on cheap Russian energy to fuel its economy. And because you lost this Russian energy, you had no choice now but to buy American LNG at 50% more, 50% markup, okay? You can tell from this chart the impact on Europe's economy, where, okay, in 2019, they weren't buying that much from the Americans. But by 2025, they're buying a lot from the Americans. And again, this is 50% more than Russian LNG. This has been terrible for especially the German economy, okay? So this is the red, the dark red are the Germans, okay? And as you can see, the decline has been pretty steep. Far more steeper than the French, the Italians, the Spanish, and the British. So the Germans are really hurting from this war. Okay? All right. The other thing is that there's been a lot of immigration to Europe. Okay? So in certain places of Europe, especially Scandinavia, the population of immigrants has gone as high as 20%, okay? In Sweden. Germany is also under a lot of stress. So there's these two trends, okay? More immigrants coming to Europe, which is threatening the local identity, as well as this war in Ukraine. So AFD, okay, AFD, which opposes immigration and which opposes war in Ukraine, they've seen a surge in popularity, okay? And honestly, if there were fair elections in Germany, at one point the AFD is gonna win, okay? So what this means is that the Germans are choosing instead to fight a war, okay? So in 2016, you can see the German military expenditure wasn't that great, but now they're going to invest a lot more in the military. Why? Because the plan is by 2029 for the Germans to have troops in Ukraine. Europe is moving towards total war, okay? Structuring the entire society for war against Russia. Everyone says that Russia is now under a lot of economic pressure, okay? And it's true that the Russians have, in fact, spent a great deal more money on the military, okay? So you can see how after the war started, you have this huge bump in military spending in the Russian Federation. But the thing to keep in mind is that it's still pretty low as part of its GDP, okay? So the green is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia spends over 10% of its GDP on the military. The Chinese spend about 2 to 3%, okay? The United States spends 5 to 4%. The Russians spend about the same, okay? So in other words, the Russians still have a long way to go. In fact, Putin still maintains that the war in Ukraine is a special military operation. It's not a full-scale war. If the moment that Putin declares war, the entire economy shifts to total war, we can expect a complete surge in spending on the military, okay? Russia hasn't reached that point yet. Now, what is Russia's plan for Europe? Putin doesn't actually want to fight Europe because it would be disastrous for both Russia and for Europe. But he understands that there's a civil war brewing in Europe where these right-wing parties like the AFD, they're surging in popularity because they oppose war and because they oppose immigrants. So all Putin has to do is force Germany into a war and drag this war out, create a war of attrition. Why? Because as this war drags on, it's going to create a lot of political tension back at home, especially if you're drafting young men to fight this war, okay? And if that were to happen, eventually, right-wing political parties like the AfD would come into power. And how does Putin know this? Because this has historically been true. This is what happened in Russia during World War I, when the Bolsheviks came to power. It almost happened in Germany, okay, when communists almost came to power in Germany. All right? So war creates political tensions, and the longer the war drags on, the greater the tension is. Okay? So basically what Putin wants to do is create a civil war in Europe, allow these right-wing pro-Russia parties to come into power, and then form an alliance between Europe, Germany, and Russia. Okay? So part one of the plan is to create as much political tension in Southeast Asia as possible by using North Korea. Part two of this plan is go to war with Europe in order to destabilize Europe politically and allow these right-wing parties to come to power and then form an alliance with them, okay? All right, now let's go on to the Global South. Okay, so the thing about the Global South is that Russia has been very supportive of the Global South, especially countries in Africa, okay? After the war started, when Russia invaded Ukraine, support for Putin in the Global South increased dramatically, as this map tells you, okay? Now the question is, wait a minute here. Russia invaded Ukraine, so why would people around the world support Russia? And the answer is because of narrative, okay? From a Western perspective, Ukraine is this innocent country and Russia is the aggressor. So clearly Russia is in the wrong. But if you are not part of the West, if you're part of the South, what you will appreciate is that the West is this imperial bully and Russia is standing up for itself. Okay? NATO was expanding too far. Ukraine was being co-opted by the West, and so Russia was trying to defend itself. And thank God that Putin and Russia now can stand up against the Americans. Okay? Because we in the South have been bullied by the Americans all this time. So the support for the Russians are particularly high in Africa, which has been subject to Western imperialism for the past 20 years. Okay, so this is a level of cooperation between Russia and African countries. As you can see, there is a lot of trade going on, but at the same time, there's also military cooperation. There's nuclear power plant construction. There's also oil exploration and nickel production. Also, there are a lot of Russian mercenaries in Africa, okay? And they're usually fighting against US-backed groups in order to control the continent. China is also heavily active in Africa. The thing about China is that it's very much focused on economic development as opposed to military intervention. The Russians use a full spectrum strategy in Africa. So they're trying to win hearts and minds. And we know that because the Russians spend a lot of effort on propaganda, okay? So the Russian flag is where they have propaganda efforts. And as you can see, China is not that heavily invested in propaganda in Africa, all right? So what Putin is also trying to do is create a narrative that Russia is liberating the world from Western imperialism. And this has particular strength in places like Africa, which has been a victim of Western imperialism for a long, long time, okay? All right, India, okay? So India, for the longest time, has been neutral. So what's been happening is that India and Russia have becoming very, very close. The impetus for their close relationship is after the war in Ukraine, Russian oil became sanctioned. So the way to evade sanctions was for Russia to sell its oil to India, which would then sell its oil around the world. Okay? So what we'll see is a very strong relationship between Russia and India develop over the next few years. What Russia wants from India are laborers. Why? Because of this war, Russia is now short of manpower. So it needs people to run its factories. Eventually, it's going to win this war in Ukraine, and it's going to need people to go rebuild Ukraine, okay? So we can expect that Russia and India will become very, very close these next 10 to 20 years. Primarily because Russia wants to invest in the relationship between Russia and India. Iran is the key to Russia creating a new world order. Why? Because first of all, as you can see, Iran is really the center of global trade. So if Russia wants to access Africa, it wants to access India, it wants to access Central Asia, Iran is very important strategically, okay? It's also very easy for Russia to trade with Iran because of the Caspian Sea, okay? All right, so basically, Russia understands that Iran is the key to global trade, Russia's global trade with the world. And that's why the Americans are actually attacking Iran. Because by attacking Iran, the Americans can block Russia from global trade, or at least destabilize it, okay? That's why one of the major battlefronts, this is actually probably one of the two major battlefronts in World War III. The first is obviously Ukraine, which will be fought between Europe and Russia. Second major battlefront will be in Iran, fought between Iran and the United States. This is also why, by the way, Israel is so important, okay? Israel. Why is Israel so important? Because Israel is the fortress, okay, the American fortress in this area. It's very possible that if put in place these cards right, all these regions will fall into the Russian sphere of influence. So America's guarantee against Russian influence is Israel. And that's why the Americans support Israel so much, because Israel is key to keeping Russia in check, okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right.